Upon meeting the Marquis de Lafayette, the young painter noticed a face worth painting. Later he said, "This is the man before me, the very man who spent his youth, fortune and his time to bring about, under Providence, our happy revolution." And so they sat, the legend and the youngster, with the light streaming in as the latter painted the former. Like other painters, Finley made all his money painting actual people, which, before he was famous, kept him tramping around Vermont and New Hampshire. In Concord, he met Lucretia. What makes a good marriage? Finley's mum said a man must be financially independent because
it is expensive to boil water, and even more expensive to keep it boiling.
The girl must show common sense, she must have domestic skills, and she had to come with a decent dowry. She warned Finley.
A slut is a terrible trial to a man.
Almost as an afterthought, she said, "It does help, son, if you love each other." Lucretia, young and beautiful, fit the bill. Almost. With a non-observant father, a brother poisoned by Unitarianism at Harvard, and friends dragging her to dances, Finley worried deeply about her soul. "Write down your thoughts and desires," he told her. "Meditate on them. Remember, there is no salvation for us save for the Lord Jesus Christ." Lucretia replied, "I once knew nothing of the depravity of my own heart." She stopped going to parties. She started quoting scripture. She wrote back to Finley, ensuring him that she felt the dawning of religious joy in her soul.
With a sincere conviction of my inability to save myself, your letters, dearest love, they first awakened my attention.
Finley had done it. A sinless marriage beckoned. That happened 2 years later, in 1818. They settled in Charleston, where Finley quickly booked $4,000 worth of portrait commissions. That is in 1819 and not in $2025. Determined to succeed as an artist, Finley experimented with new techniques, and he worked long hours as he endeavoured to become what his mother had told him to become, financially independent. Charlestown's councillors noticed Finley's talent, and soon they commissioned him to paint President James Monroe. At about the same time, baby Susan arrived. Not long after that, the amazing commission came. The Marquis de Lafayette was finishing a victory tour of the United States. Finley went to Washington, where he breakfasted with the great man himself, getting to know his subject, and later writing to Lucretia about the terror of tyrants, the firm and consistent supporter of liberty. She wrote back,
"We must begin to feel proud of your acquaintance. I think that now we can indulge in a rational hope that the time is not far when you'll be happy in the bosom of your much-loved family, and that your dear children can enjoy the permanent advantage of an affectionate father's counsel and care."
Finley hoped for that too, but he needed to stay in Washington to complete the portrait. These were exhilarating days. He witnessed debates between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, and he painted the most famous people, not just of the time, but in the whole of American history. Finley awaited a reply to his latest letter. Instead, a note from his father arrived. "My affectionately beloved son, my heart is in pain and deeply sorrowful while I announce to you the sudden and unexpected death of your dear and deservedly beloved wife." Lucretia had hidden her chest spasms from Finley. After giving birth, though, she seemed fine until she leaned back, closed her eyes, and never opened them again. By the time Finley returned, she had already been buried. In this shocking moment, Finley learnt an awful truth. With only rare exceptions, communication and transportation were synonymous. A message could only travel as fast as a horse could gallop, a ship could sail, or a man, in the case of Pheidippides, on his journey from Marathon to Athens, could run. The message came too late to say goodbye, too late even to make it back in time for the funeral. Welcome to this episode of Visionaries, Rebels and Machines. I am Jamie Dobson, and today's episode is called What God Hath Wrought. What hath God wrought indeed? That was the terribly sad story of Finley and Lucretia, whose death catalyzed Finley's transformation from an up-and-coming painter to what history would call the Lightning Man. In his grief, Finley escaped for Europe. More painting practice, more technique, more inspiration. His plan was to focus on his art and escape the pain of his loss. Now, during that winter, he spent a lot of time at the Louvre in Paris, and maybe after giving up on himself, or at least giving up on his financial needs, he started to turn down the offers of portrait paintings, and instead he set his mind on an extremely ambitious project. He would paint the Salon Carrère, the original saloon. This room was filled with masterpieces, 37 or 38 of them, depending which history book you read. They would each find a place on Finley's gigantic canvas. As winter turned to spring and as bodies piled high outside because the cholera epidemic of that year swept through the city, Finley busied himself. Finley refused to let the cholera outside and the political violence in Paris slow him down. He was proud to risk his life finishing this work. Proud, but confident, because he said that all was safe in the hands of him to whom I confided all my time and eternity. So Finley may have been shattered physically and emotionally, but spiritually he was not. His frenzied work caused a stir in a city already frenzied with cholera and political violence. Visitors would come to watch this strange American working on what would become known as the Grand Gallery of the Louvre. Well, what hung in the Grand Gallery? There was, of course, the Mona Lisa. There was Rembrandt's Angel Leaving Tobias, Murillo's Beggar Boy, Raphael's Belle Jardiniere, and of course, further paintings by Leonardo, Poussin and Rubens. Would it work? Finley arrived in Paris depressed. Had his spirits been lifted? Would the Grand Gallery of the Louvre bring him the fame and fortune he desired? Maybe, maybe not. In Paris he certainly improved his brushwork. But the Grand Gallery of the Louvre was a copy of greatness. It was not a greatness itself. Finley was struggling. He said later that his lack of improvement as a painter unremittingly tortured him. Things did not get better when he arrived back in the United States. He felt the poverty of being an artist. He felt diffused. He couldn't concentrate. For 20 years, he'd struggled to survive as the sort of painter he wanted to be. "My profession is that of a beggar," he moaned. "It exists on charity." With no masterpiece on the horizon, Finley resigned himself to a life of poverty, saying, "My life of poetry in romance is gone. I must descend from the clouds and look more at the earth." Finley floated around like this for 5 more years. Then something happened. In a neat reversal, for Finley was once an American in France, 2 Frenchmen arrived in the United States and jolted Finley back to life. They claimed they had a system for transmitting words over any distance and as fast as the speed of light. If their claims were true, for the very first time in human history, communication and transportation would be divorced. In the exact same way that Aldini's spark failed to bring George Foster back to life, this spark brought Finley back to life instantly. But why? What had happened? They had stolen his idea. 5 years earlier, travelling back to the United States on board the Sully, with his gigantic painting of the Louvre in the hold, Finley got to know the other passengers very well. One evening, around the dinner table, a certain Dr. Charles Jackson from Boston, who carried with him an electromagnet, explained electricity to his fellow diners. Finley claimed later that at that very moment an idea struck him like a bolt of lightning. If part of a circuit can be made visible by the presence of electricity, Finley said, "I see no reason why intelligence might not be instantaneously transmitted by electricity to any distance." He stepped outside on the deck of the Sully for some air. It was at that moment, he later claimed, he devised a code for sending down the circuit. That lightning bolt, that evening on the deck of the Sully, killed Finley Morse the painter, and from his ashes arose his replacement, Samuel Morse, the inventor. A few months after the French inventors arrived in April of that year, the American press started to report remarkable stories from back in Europe. The first came from Scotland. A man, William Alexander, suggested that 26 copper wires be laid between Edinburgh and London. Each wire would represent a single character from the alphabet. Typing in Scotland, a switch would be closed and a circuit completed, thus causing a signal in London. Letters typed in Scotland would, in other words, appear in London and vice versa. Over in Germany, ingenious bishops wired their cathedrals up so they could talk to each other. I suppose, by the way, if they were Catholic, they could speak to the Pope back in Rome. Most importantly of all, there was talk from London. An eminent scientific gentleman was working on a device to send an electric current through 5 separate wires. This gentleman was called William Fothergill Cooke. Already panicked from the arrival of the Frenchman in April, Morse panicked again. These stories reported the same device that he had conceived on the Sully 5 years earlier, and he'd been messing around with ever since. Well, what had happened? Why had he not made any progress? Mirroring the struggles of Cooke in England, Morse could not get the damn device to transmit any further than a few feet. Both men were conceptually strong, but they were practically weak. They needed assistance. Now Cooke enlisted the help of a certain Professor Charles Wheatstone of King's College in London. In the United States, Samuel Morse sought out New York University professor Leonard D. Gale. Gale immediately realised that the galvanic battery only had a single zinc and copper plate inside. You will recall from episode 1 that this would have barely made Volta's tongue tingle. Such a low voltage would never carry a signal very far. Gale added 40 extra discs and whilst he was at it, wound the wires in the circuit tight, thus getting them to stretch further. This basic understanding of electricity and how it is conducted eluded Morse. Using Gale's battery, Morse broadcast a message 1,700 feet. That, for the people in the United Kingdom and America, is about 1/3 of a mile. For the rest of the world, that's about 500 metres. Morse's confidence grew. He started now to visualise wires cast all around the world, not just in America. His 5 years of dragging his heels ended and his fears of failure transformed into dreams of success. Morse and Gale's prototype now needed scaling. That fell to a man called Alfred Vail. Vail doubted the telegraph would work over a large distance. Morse, however, managed to change his mind. In a flash of inspiration, Morse reasoned that as a signal weakens, whether that's at a mile, 2 miles, 50 miles or 100, instead of printing the code on a piece of paper, the insight he had on the deck of the Sully, the current would activate a different switch. So a signal came into a new station, a new device yet to be invented would tap in the code, and its battery would send the signal on its way like a baton is sent on its way in a relay race. Batteries were a known quantity, so too were wires, the currents they carried, and a switch was of course just a switch. This special switch, called a relay, would be remote controlled by the incoming current, but it was a switch nonetheless. Using relays, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Vail realised he could use his skills and his dad's money to scale Samuel Morse's system. Vail came from a rich family, and so money for equipment and technical expertise were exchanged for formal articles of agreement with Morse. They had become business partners. With his skills and money, the literary, artistic, and importantly to Samuel, pious Alfred Vail, began to bring Morse's vision to life. Because optical telegrams with their funny arms could communicate at a distance of 10 miles, Morse and Vail had to show their telegraph worked at greater distances than that. They set up experiments in New York. Some failed and some succeeded. The failures threw Morse into deep despair. Throughout this time, Vail busied himself building the system and perfected it for the demonstration. Morse continued to figure out his codes because at that time he had multiple ideas. One of the ideas was for a gigantic dictionary to live at both ends of the telegraph line. How did Samuel Morse's strange dictionary work? Well, inside the book, words were mapped to codes. So, for example, ABC might map to visionaries, rebels, and machines. Rather than sending the whole message down the line, you only had to send the code. This, of course, must sound very familiar to computer programmers listening in. It is, of course, a compression algorithm. So when you zip up a file and send it to your mum on email, the zip algorithm looks for common bits, assigns a symbol to them, and then when it sends the file, it sends the dictionary along with it. This means Samuel Morse figured out compression centuries before us computer scientists thought about it. So Samuel Morse, in essence, was working on the software of the telegraph, while Alfred Vail was working on the hardware. By the time they did the next big demonstration in Philadelphia at the Franklin Institute, Morse had given up on the idea of the dictionary. He was, at that point, working on a system that would soon become known as Morse code. This system mapped dots and dashes to letters of the alphabet. So down the wire, they would be sent. At the other end, an automatic piece of machinery marked the dots and dashes on a piece of paper. The telegram operator then decoded the signal into a real message. Years later, telegraph operators such as Thomas Edison could actually listen to the telegraph dots and dashes and translate it instantly. They could, in other words, decode the telegraph by ear. Not long after the Franklin demonstration, Vail boxed everything up and shipped it to Washington, D.C. His ambition to wow the politicians there into supporting their endeavours. In Washington, Vail began to see the true nature of Samuel Morse. It was there that he continued to describe Vail as his assistant. Maybe it was because Samuel Morse was a painter and he was used to doing everything himself. Maybe he got caught in the rather stupid idea that he was the inventor and Vail was just the toolmaker. Vail eventually confronted Morse with this, and of course Samuel Morse chickened out, telling Vail, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I thought assistant was synonymous with partner or colleague. What you see there is Samuel Morse was indeed a visionary and a rebel, but by no means the paragon of the perfect human being." Despite the terrible Washington weather, members of Congress and those working at the Treasury and at the Department for War came to see the telegraph. Morse even sent a telegraph to President Van Buren. Most people were dumbstruck. Morse said he saw no enemies and only found supporters. Vail corroborated this, describing the response to the telegraph as unreal. He later said that some politicians had asked, what would Thomas Jefferson think of this? Where will the improvements to this science end? Could Jefferson be made to rise up? I suppose made to rise up a little bit like Aldani have tried to rise up George Foster. Another said, this is the most wonderful discovery ever made. It surely must belong to the government. The Committee of Commerce agreed to award Samuel Morse $30,000 to fund a longer line. They needed to see if this thing could work over distances of 50 miles or more. Back over in the United Kingdom, William Cooke made progress too. In a mirror image of Morse's, to help with the practical side of the telegraph, Cooke enlisted the help of Professor Charles Wheatstone. Wheatstone was to Cooke what Gale and Vail were to Morse. He was the practical right-hand man. However, in an extremely strange reversal, Wheatstone, the snob, who had been brought into the project by Cooke for his scientific knowledge, spoke about the telegraph like it was his invention. Cooke, on the other hand, was nothing more than a business associate. It just so happened that Wheatstone has brought him on board to help promote the device. This, of course, could not have been further from the truth. Again, mirroring Morse and Vail, despite not getting along personally, Wheatstone and Cooke had a fantastic working relationship. They invented a system whose needles picked out letters and numbers from a diamond-shaped box. The needles pointed to a letter on the diamond a little bit like a glass was pointed and moved over a Ouija board. The diamond board did not have enough space for 26 letters, and so C, J, Q, U and X were all dropped. And of course that didn't matter, because they could be replaced. Wherever there was meant to be a J, you could use a Y. Wherever there was meant to be a Q, you could use a K, and vice versa. Now, you might be thinking, well, what are the benefits of Cook and Wheatstone's wobbly needles with the letters at the other end? Well, it's exactly the same as that 26-wire system from Edinburgh to London. The letters came out exactly how they went in. So, for example, the diamond would show D-O-B-S-O-N, Dobson. You could read that message as it came in. Morse's code, on the other hand, required a codebook to first code and then later decode the message on the other end. Despite the slight differences in how these messages were coded and decoded, Morse, Gale and Vale in the US and Cook and Wheatstone in the UK had one way or another done the impossible. They had both created systems that divorced communication and transportation. The arrival of those two Frenchmen had activated something within Morse. He then sought out help from Gale and Vale. Morse and Vale then returned from Washington with a $30,000 grant to test the system. Cook and Wheatstone, on the other hand, had already proved their concept on a small stretch of railway line. With the words of Congress ringing in Samuel Morse's ear and mirroring Cook's sentiment in the United Kingdom, Morse visualised a world wrapped in a net of wires and batteries, a world where news and gossip travelled and battles were coordinated at the speed of light. Fortune and glory surely awaited Samuel Morse and William Cook. Before Congress approved the funding for his 50-mile line, Morse left for the United Kingdom. He would secure himself a patent, while he, of course, had momentum on his side. Samuel Morse, in travelling to England, made a terrible mistake. The Attorney General, Sir John Campbell, in the United Kingdom, refused to even consider granting Samuel Morse a patent. Campbell showed Morse the February issue of the London Mechanics magazine, where Morse's methods had already been published. Well, you can't patent an invention if it's already in the public domain. Showing the tenacity that helped him master brushstrokes, Morse did what inventors always do. He acquired the services of an outstanding patent lawyer. The lawyer got him a second audience with Campbell. All this did was throw Campbell into a fit of rage. America was a large enough country, he told Morse. You ought to be satisfied with a patent over there. Of course, on the same trip, he crossed paths with Cook and Wheatstone. This led Morse to the conclusion that their systems were radically different. This is, of course, nonsense. With the exception, and it's a small exception, of the code, they had both invented an almost identical system. One was VHS, the other was Betamax. One was Microsoft Azure, and the other one was Amazon Web Services. Any differences in these systems was cast in the light of their similarities. Chastised by Sir John Campbell, Morse returned to the United States, where the bill to ratify the $30,000 grant had yet to pass through Congress. When the day to discuss the bill arrived, Cave Johnson of Tennessee stood up and said it was futile for Uncle Sam to foot the bill. We may as well spend the money on investigating mesmerism, he said. And then, with his tongue in cheek, at least I think his tongue might have been in cheek, he said he would only support the bill if a proposed amendment for mesmerism was included. This, of course, brought the House down laughing. The pious Samuel Morse had forgotten his Eclesiastes. Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of desire. A bird in the hand is, in other words, better than two in the bush. While he'd wasted his time in England, the United States Congress were having second thoughts about his proposal. In the UK, Cook fared no better. He got a demonstration running along the train line from Slough to Paddington. However, Great Western Railway, who he convinced after the British Navy said they saw no use for the telegraph, started to lose interest in this stupid experiment. In his desperation, Cook said he'd fund it himself, especially since the government had said, "We want nothing to do with your wobbling needle voodoo." The situation completely perplexed Cook. In those days, station masters coordinated trains with printed timetables. As soon as the trains broke down, so too did the timetables. The telegraph allowed for real-time communication, but unbelievably, the railway companies did not see the value in this. As 1842 came to an end, Gale and Vale in the United States were in utter despair. Their efforts and their money had been wasted. As 1843 dawned, Cook noted that his team were at their lowest point of depression. The telegraph would never see the light of day because it would never overcome the huge dollops of skepticism on both sides of the Atlantic. This, of course, sounds insane to us, but there is an explanation. Epoch-changing technologies have to coexist with the attitudes of the age in which they're invented. They've somehow got to push through the noise of the day, the daily chores of the housewives and their daughters, the politics, and of course the mood of the people. Don't forget, at the time, the real tensions that would eventually lead to the American Civil War were rising up. Samuel Morse had to somehow get through all of that noise. This is what we call the crossover decades, when a technology arrives and has to survive until a willing public and their politicians are ready to accept it. But that Samuel Morse tenacity was back. He dug in. And Cook and Wheatstone back in the United Kingdom had found a promoter who helped pay for the Slough to Paddington line. Their dream was therefore kept alive. Their good luck and their tenacity in the next 2 years would pay off. On August 6, 1944, Queen Victoria's son was born at Windsor Castle, which was just outside the train station at Slough. The news was sent back down the wire. Now, not long after that, the Times hit the streets, and the Duke of Wellington all of a sudden started to make arrangements to head to Slough to congratulate the Queen himself. Of course, he forgot his dinner jacket. He telegraphed back to London, and the dinner jacket was sent on the next train. In another unforeseen demonstration of the telegraph's usefulness, a criminal named Fiddler Dick was captured. Now, Dick used to pick people's pockets, and once he'd picked them, he would jump on a train and hot-foot it from Slough to Paddington, or in the opposite direction, back from Paddington to Slough. But of course, once the telegraph arrived, the crime and the criminal's description were sent all the way back to the following station, where, of course, Fiddler Dick was arrested. Just as interest started to wane and wobble, and the poor telegraph receded further from the public's imagination, John Tarwell brought it back again. A year after the birth of Prince Albert, Tarwell murdered his girlfriend in Slough before escaping on the train to London. Now, you have to remember, Cook and Wheatstone's telegraph system did not contain a key for Q. So, the message said that the police must watch out for Tarwell. He has a dark overcoat on, and he's in the garb of a Quaker. But of course there was no Q, so they spelt it with a K. The police arrested Tarwell. When the newspaper reported Tarwell's capture and later execution, they said the telegraph were the cords that hung John Tarwell. Over in the United States, Morse, despite the mocking of the congressman from Tennessee, finally had his money approved. Laus Deo, he cried. God be praised. Morse got busy with the Baltimore to Washington line. First of all, though, he had supply issues. The wires never arrived on time. Now, the legend goes that Samuel Morse spoke to the head of his gang of labourers. He was called Ezra Cornell. Cornell then deliberately crashed his trenching machine into a wall. The newspapers had a story to report, and of course, Morse had his first excuse for the delays. Now, not long after that, acid in the soil corroded the pipes. What that meant was any contact between the pipes and the telegraph wires would cause a short circuit. Morse, now panicked again, resorted to an earlier idea. He would hang the cables above the ground until at least they could figure out the piping problem. This short-term hack, of course, would go on to blight the world's landscapes. Proof, if you need it, that a hack brought in during a system's development can have long and often irreversible effects in its final version. It didn't matter to Samuel Morse or Ezra Cornell at the time. Cornell worked hard. The poles, which were basically chestnut trees, shot up at an alarming rate. Every time Morse added extra distance between his Baltimore to Washington line, he experimented again. Then, on May the 1st, he unleashed the true power of the telegraph. The Whig National Convention in Baltimore nominated Henry Clay and Theodore Frelinghuysen as their candidates for the upcoming presidential and vice presidential elections. Stationed at Annapolis Junction, Vail took the results, delivered from Baltimore on the train, and sent them at the speed of light the final 22 miles to Washington. People were amazed. 3 weeks later, the work was done and the telegraph officially opened on May the 24th, 1844. Vail took care of the Baltimore end of the telegraph line. Samuel Morse set up on the other side in the chamber of the United States Supreme Court. Annie Ellsworth, who was the daughter of one of the politicians who had helped Morse secure the $30,000, would test the line. She was, of course, unsure what to say and couldn't think of an appropriate message, so she spoke to her mother. Her mother suggested the exclamation of the prophetic Balaam in Numbers 23:23. So, the first message that was sent on the telegraph from the Supreme Court to Baltimore said, "What hath God wrought?" What hath God wrought indeed? It of course did not take very long for skepticism to melt away. Before long, people could read about the lightning line in the newspapers, and later they published Morse's code, its dots and its dashes, the alphabet in full. And they explained, in the simplest terms possible, how the system worked, how the batteries powered the line, and how the relay amplified the signal. Did any of it make sense to the readers? It's hard to say. Morse explained to members of Congress, and a bystander observed that the congressmen looked as if Samuel had spoken Hebrew. The ability to divorce transportation from communication, something that had never been done in the history of humanity, was like something out of Arabian Nights. The telegraph baffled people. What was this supernatural agency, they asked? What was this godlike power? Historians have described this moment as transformative. This feeling did not return to the human race until Robert Oppenheimer's bombs were dropped on Japan. The newspaper reported that Samuel Morse annihilated space and time. The newspapers joked Samuel Morse's machine went backwards in time because any messages sent from New York at 7 in the morning would arrive earlier than they'd actually been sent. Others considered the telegraph to be much closer to teleportation than they did communication. Somehow, they said, Morse had transmuted human thought into metal strips of jars and acids. A congressman reported at the time, "If this machinery don't think, it does that which nothing but severe and profound thinking can do, and it does it incomparably better." This machine was a new species of consciousness. Why do humans do this? Back then, just like in the 1970s with the computer program Eliza, and just like right now with generative AI systems like ChatGPT, whenever a person sees words, they assume behind the words is another mind. That wasn't true for the telegraph. And spoiler alert, it's not true for ChatGPT either. Others at the time said the telegraph was like the central nervous system. Touch one nerve with a skillful hand and, like Aldini understood, a signal passed through the whole system. Only this time it did not pass through a body, but the body politique. A signal in New York made Chicago twitch and Philadelphia flutter. We are now almost at the end of our journey and our episode. We saw a theme that us system builders and entrepreneurs understand. As our confidence grows, fears of failure make way for dreams of success. Samuel Morse felt this, we felt it too. We also saw, once again, that the destiny of a system lies not in the hands of its creators, but in the hands of its users. Once it was in users' hands, the telegraph found real purposes. We also, in a step change from Volta and Galvani, saw the emergence of multidisciplinary teamwork. And of course, we saw, because so much money was involved, the rewriting of history. So even now, the truth about what happened on the Sully is not known. Soon after Samuel Morse's success in the Supreme Court that day, teams of people, around the United States and indeed around the world would code and decode, send and receive telegraph messages. Ezra Cornell, who had helped Samuel Morse build his Baltimore to Washington line, went on to found Western Union. They became the dominant player in telegraphy. Not long after that company was founded, they worked out how to send money by wire. And of course, you will notice today, Western Union still has a business in wire transfers. A number of New York publications also got together. They wanted to share the cost of sending and receiving news stories over the wire. They called their organization the Associated Press. And so, the telegraph, long since redundant as a technology, continues to exist, even today, through the work of the Associated Press and the work of Western Union. An aging Samuel Morse sits down. The young man doesn't know he's painting a fellow artist. He thinks he's painting a legend. He thinks he's painting the Lightning Man. Hey everybody, thanks for listening. Just a reminder to follow Visionaries, Rebels and Machines on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please do leave a rating and review if you like what we're doing. It helps other people to discover the show. And of course, we'd like a few more listeners. To find out more about me, the work I do, or to buy a copy of the book, please visit the website. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next episode.